Strength, courage, and wisdom. Anybody who's been a mom, you know how much we've needed that, right? Oh, man. All right. So, because it's Mother's Day, we're going to talk a little bit about nature versus nurture because, that's a massive conversation that's been going on for a couple hundred years. Do people come in as a tabula rasa and they're just all messed up because of the people that they grew up with? And is it all nurture, or do people come in? Do we come in originally sinned? Do we come in as terrible, horrible children who want nothing but for ourselves and have to be trained in some way? What is the deal here? And so much of that falls onto moms, especially the nurture part. So today's talk is like an essay. Kind of rambles a little bit. So a lot of the things that I've learned and studied over the years and that I don't always get a chance to talk about. And these are the things that I think all of us should be paying attention to and thinking about when we think about the situation for women in society today with all the anti-abortion things that are going on, all the continued suppression of women. We still haven't passed the Equal Rights Amendment. It's pretty extraordinary, the number of single moms, particularly in the cultures or in the areas of poverty, people of color who are trying to raise their children by themselves on less than minimum wage. There's a host of things that are still not right with the group of people that make up 50% of the population. Lots and lots of strides have been made. Lots of strides are being made throughout the world. There's lots of places where the education of women has been seen as a turning point in cultures, and yet there are also places where that is, again, being closed down. And so it's part of the reason why we're celebrating the divine feminine this whole month, because we want to bring it to the table. We want to bring it spiritually to the table and personally to the table. It is a part of our social justice issues that we're facing, and we want to educate ourselves and find a way to be present to it that really aligns with our spirituality. So this is an opportunity, right? And as I closed last week, remember that matriarchy is not the opposite of patriarchy. It's not about elevating women above men. It is about building a place where there's a recognition of the deep equality and the equity that's needed, and a recognition that we're all different and we all bring something else to the table. And it may actually not have to do with our biological genitalia that we were born with. That the divine feminine does in fact live within all of us. It is more present in some of us than in others, which is not inappropriate in any way because we all bring things forward. And so this is a bit of a conversation. I invite you to just see what is here for you and to think about these things because it feels important. So one of the things that we don't talk about very much, especially if you, like me, were raised in a Catholic church or in a Christian tradition, is that there are two versions of the creation of Adam and Eve, or of the first humans. And actually, the first creation of the first humans is made on day 6 of creation, and it is Genesis 1, 26, 27. And God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, after our likeness." And then he talks about, then there's a conversation about the birds and the bees and the fowl and the all of nature, that we have dominion over all of nature. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God created he them. Male and female created he them. And this passage has puzzled scholars for a long time. How can we have monotheism when we have a God that says, let us make God in our image? And of course, it's a recognition later in the Hebrew Bible, a recognition that Sophia is the name that is given to wisdom, and in the Psalms and in some of the books of the later Bible, especially in the Psalms, Sophia says, and I was when God began or became. I was with God and was part of the creation of the world, part of the creation of earth. And so wisdom, as Sophia, as the feminine face of the divine, was present even in these very, very, very ancient teachings. And it doesn't get brought forward. It's not made primary, as we talked about last week. And again, here's the Ernest Holmes quote, humanity then is the actual incarnation of universal spirit. Every man or woman is the incarnation of the original creative spirit. The incarnation of spirit in us, as us, is us. Male and female created he them. And so, right, it's always about biology, isn't it? It always starts with biology and the idea that biologically we are so different, which then has been evolved into the idea that there is a gender difference between who we are as men and as women, as governed by our biology. And yet there are so many things that both corroborate this and also deny this. And so maybe it's more than just our biology, right? It's why we're talking about nature versus nurture. And we'll see if maybe it's both and as opposed to an either or. What you might not know is that when, that you always hear about the flight or flight, right? The reptilian brain has a stimulus response, and the response is fight, flight. They did some more studies, and then it became freeze. Fight, flight, or freeze as the primary responses. And we all have them, except that all of those studies were originally done with men. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Just like heart attacks show up differently in women, ADHD shows up differently in the feminine system, in the female system. So does this biology. And so somebody thought about, well, that's interesting. Why don't we do the same study but do it for women? And the predominant response in women, not all, because of course we all have feminine and masculine energies within us, but the predominant response within women is actually tend and befriend, not fight or flight. It's actually tend and befriend. Fight or flight seems to be very much out of the sort of masculine biological focus of forward, move forward, seek threats, provide, hunt, look for, right? It's this motion. And there's a way of focusing that the divine masculine has that is extraordinary and necessary. And it shows up in this idea of protecting and providing. Tend and befriend is this. And they describe it as, while the men are outside the cave, making sure the lion isn't getting in, and making sure that they're hunting for food, when the river rises and it seeks to get into the cave, what the women are doing is looking around. Where are the kids? Do you need help? Do you have all your stuff? What are we doing? Oh, will you help take my kid with your kid? So tend and befriend. They're looking for what needs to be taken care of, who needs to be included, and who can I help, and who will help me. Biologically designed to be a complement to the divine masculine, taking care of the threat, protecting and providing, the tending and befriending, right? And we all also have both of them within us. We have just not made tend and befriend as valuable. We can see that in our history lessons. If you go to history, right, what do you learn about the wars? Who won? Who lost? Not the stories of how new cultures were created, how people were brought into new situations, how people befriended each other, took care of each other. All right, that doesn't make it into our history books. The recognition that the biology that comes with the predominantly female biology is one about helping, tending, gathering, and being a part of something. And remember where we ended up last time, right? Also that we have this within both of us. We have both of these things within us. The challenge has been over the centuries, the equivalent of behavior and biology have either been rewarded, and when those two things don't align, in many cases, particularly in the Western culture, it has been ridiculed. When behavior and biology don't seem to align in the way that we expect, or the way that our culture over the last 5,000 years has evolved. And yet, one of the things we know from a spiritual point of view is that consciousness has been growing an organ in which it could reveal itself to itself, and that is self-awareness. That is self-consciousness. And the very innate nature and the very impulse of life itself has been to grow an organ in which consciousness can reveal itself. And so beyond the biology, there is that which is the very truth of our being, the very spiritual nature that we have, and then the tendencies and the ways in which that spiritual impulse is individuated, right? We understand ourselves to be individualized expressions of the one. Individualized, not cookie cuttered, right? Not 10 people are a circle and 10 people are a square and 10 people are a star and 10 people are a triangle. No. Individualized expressions of the one, cloaked in a form and a way of showing up in the world, which then, of course, does get rewarded or not in the predominant culture in which we grow up in. So, and when that predominant culture always goes back to nature, this is the way it's supposed to be, the way you're supposed to be, the way you're supposed to behave and look, and what your biology destines you for, then what we have are boxes, expectations, and stories about how people are supposed to behave. A man is supposed to be this, a woman is supposed to be that, right? And that is when biology is the piece that's driving it. And of course, we see with our, first of all, LGBTQ beloveds, as well as the enormous push that has been going on for centuries, but really also in the last few hundred years for women to say, excuse me, I should be able to own my own property, have a credit card, vote, manage my own body. These actually are things that should belong to me as a human being, not just as fitting into the box, just as men may find themselves very boxed in by a certain expectation of masculinity. We call it today toxic masculinity. And it's the finding the space where the spiritual reality is allowing itself to be revealed, which allows us to be the fullness of who we are. Yeah. You know, for years, people, when birth became a medical event, nurses and doctors made the decision about the genitalia when a child was born, when an infant was born, because people are born with both. We know that. That has been documented for millennium. Hermaphrodites are a very real thing, and they made decisions. They just didn't talk about it. They just didn't say that they had made that decision. But depending on how the child is experiencing the hormones and the experience of the mother can have all kinds of impact on how this child shows up in the world. And the idea that someone has no sexuality at all or has no sense of sexuality has also been long documented, centuries and centuries of documentation. Of course, we have Sappho from the ancient Greeks. We have lots of recognition of the ancient Greeks in their conversation about the older men with younger men and all of that. And of course, we now also see that we have lots of experiences about that within the animal kingdom. 10% of the animal kingdom, then they've studied ducks and monkeys and geese and I can't remember 4 or 5 other types of animals sort of at all levels, and 10% of them behave in a homosexual way, which is mind-boggling for people who don't recognize this as part of the fluidity that biology isn't destiny. How many of you are familiar with the Kinsey report? A few of you. The Kinsey report in the 50s and 60s. Kinsey studied human sexuality, and of course, it was a huge scandal, giant scandal. It's really interesting. You should go read it. There's also some documentaries about it. And the scandal is that he discovered that, like everything else, human sexuality is on a bell curve. That means 10% of people are unalterably, absolutely, without any sense of anything different, heterosexual. 10% of them are unalterably, absolutely homosexual. That's just it. Where are the rest of us? On the bell curve. 80% of human beings, at least in the people that they studied, it was here in the United States, people that they studied, 80% of human beings have some form of bisexuality, actually. Little bit of, if you're over here, on down here, maybe just a little attraction, maybe on the top, maybe going either way. Huge scandal. And it was suppressed. But you can learn about it, right? Because consciousness has found an organ in which to reveal its fullness, its full truth, that this is all of who we are. So I have lots of personal experiences with this. One of them came as when my son and I, we moved in with my parents. My son was 18 months old. I'd run away when I was 15, and I was 32. And I said, I have a 15-month-old baby. I can't support him here, my cabin in the woods. Can I come home? My mom and stepfather had already moved here to Dallas, to the Fort Worth, up to the Flower Mound area. And he had taken an Episcopalian church because he was a priest in the Episcopalian religion. And so it was lovely. They, out of the Christian goodness of his heart, he allowed me to come in. And my mother was a huge boon for me in taking care of my son. Just lovely. They had an amazing relationship until she passed away. And now I remember that one day, because I was serving this community here as an interim minister. I'd already been a minister for 10 years. And I said one day at the dinner table, I asked and said, so I'd like to share the grace, the prayer that we say for grace at the table, because I'd like for my son to grow up in my spirituality and my tradition as much as he would grow up in your spirituality and your tradition. I'm perfectly happy that, both of these kinds of grace or prayers are said. And the answer was absolutely not. No, not only no, but I don't know what God you pray to. So you can't bring that to my dinner table. And my mother said, well, this seems a little odd. And I turned to my mother and I said, well, can you pray at the table? Do you say the prayer at the table? And she said, well, I don't normally because Bill is the priest and, I think that's a good thing. But of course I could pray at the table because I too am a Christian. And my stepfather said, oh, no. No, women don't pray at the table. I'm the head of the household. Well, I will tell you that was a shocking moment for my mother. She did not realize that. And I am sorry to say that I did say, and I'd like to know what my genitalia has to do with my ability to pray. It's not a particularly kind response. I did not quite say it in that even tone of voice. And unfortunately for my mother, who was very saddened by it, we stopped eating together at the table so that my son could actually be raised in the tradition that I also believe is really empowering. I had no problem with them reading in the Bible and talking to him. My mother gave him a child Bible very early on. They spent a lot of time on all of that. It was lovely. My mother had a true deep calling, a deep spirituality. She did prayer with people, healing work with people. She did all kinds of amazing things. And yes, of course, we understand they're all different paths. Every one of them is a valid and different path up the same mountain that we're all climbing. But I have to tell you, that was a moment. And I was stunned that in 1994, that was still being promulgated. The inability of women to whatever, right? And if you think about the centuries and millennium that women have been set aside and have been undermined in the very gifts that we have to give, all the way back into the deep ancient tradition that we get in the Old Testament of women being unclean, right? Unclean because of their monthly cycle and needing to be set aside during that monthly cycle. And science, early science, in which women were not participating. There was a lot of conversation about how women were hysterical, emotional, illogical, unable to be rational, and therefore there was no reason to educate them. You can read it in the books. It's in black and white writing. And of course, we see it today, and where there is a resurgence of that sort of thought. On the other hand, what's really interesting, how many of you read this fabulous book called The Red Tent? Right? If you haven't, women, men, you could read it too. It's called The Red Tent. And they're like, oh, thank God we don't have to be around the men for a week. They talk about how amazing it is to withdraw from the masculine energy and be together and just be women and just be able to be themselves and just be able to, and it's a whole entire other point of view about this, you're unclean and you can't be around. And do you see, it's never an either or. It's always a both and. And the extraordinary thing that has come out of the spiritual work that I've done with women over the years, and the studies that I've done, and all the work that is being done, you know, this whole idea about the premenstrual syndrome. And I hope that you are all men who never say to your wife, girlfriend, employer, employee, or child, oh, it's that time of the month, isn't it? Because this is what's used to show how hysterical and illogical women are. And yet one of the things that has been revealed in all this deep spiritual work that's been done, and in countless work of depth psychology and therapy, is that that which is being revealed in that premenstrual time is usually really important information for women that they've been suppressing for the rest of the cycle, because they've been abdicating, making nice, living in a box, doing what women are supposed to be doing. And it escapes in that period of time. And if we don't understand that that's what's happening, we become angry, violent, depressed, or all of those other things. But if we can recognize that there's value in what's being revealed, because the box is being opened, then men and women can have compassion for that moment in a woman's life. Maybe ask some valuable questions. Maybe allow for space of exploration. And maybe we would stop being so hard and angry with ourselves for in those times becoming irrational or illogical or emotional, or unclear. These are there's so many things, and I'm completely run out of time. There's so many things I want to talk to you about. Why is it about long hair and covering hair? Well, the whole thing, you go back to Mary Magdalene, Lilith, and Eve, and the Virgin, right? And long hair allows for that sensuality to come out, and the Madonna always is covered, right? Because, as an imam said to me one time when I was invited to speak downtown at a mosque, and the men are in front and the women are in back, and he said to the men, I want you to understand, I have invited a woman to speak to you because the very first person who you listened to was your mother. And I said, well, if you're that progressive, why are the women always in the back? And his answer was, because men cannot control themselves when they see a woman kneeling in front of them with their butt in the air, whereas a woman can. That's what he said. It's like, I don't really know how to answer that question. I'm like, okay. But we have to go back to the temple priestesses and all the reasons why, right? You can't, how much that was made bad and wrong because they were powerful women who were sharing spirituality with the men. And so just because while we're on it, remember the whole thing about masturbation and not spreading your seed, right? Because that was aimed specifically at the fertility goddess traditions, where the temple priest would take the king for the year out to the fields. And in the spring, they would make love in the fields, and the man would pull out and he would disperse his seed into the ground. Why? To fertilize Mother Earth. To bless Mother Earth, to pray for the crops being fertile and to be renewed. And it was an act of deep sacredness. What have we lost? What have we lost in not understanding these things? Right, I have a granddaughter. We go down the pink aisle. Oh, God, in the pink aisle in the toy department. There's the pink aisle, then there's the mechanical aisle, which is clearly the boy aisle, and then there's the aisle in between. We need more of that, right? The ancient indigenous traditions, they had the two-spirited people, right? They had no problem with their shamans who wanted to dress up as a woman if they were a man, or a man if they were a woman. Understanding this deep recognition that we are both divine masculine and divine feminine. This is the truth of who we are. And, this is a slide from last week. No, that's not true. This is my quote for today. Ernest Holmes says the first cause is both masculine and feminine in its nature. And my quote for today is embrace the divine feminine to bring humanity back into balance, that we may have all of it. And I'll leave you with this last statistic. It comes out of the UN. It was a statistic that was shared, I think it was 2 years ago, because there are wars that continue to break out and continue to happen, and there are places where there's constant churning over and over and over again. And they did a study of all the peace accords, those peace accords that have stayed valid and those peace accords that fell apart relatively quickly. And in every case, without exception, the peace accords that had longevity, there was a woman at the table. Yes, not better than, equal to, bringing all of it to the table. Allowing those of us who maybe are a little more masculine in a feminine body, and those who are a little more feminine in a masculine body, those who are perfectly balanced. Yeah, we wish, right? But I'm sure there are some people like that, right? Yeah. Ultimately, by raising the divine feminine, we come to a place of wholeness. So things to think about: observe, become self-aware, watch, notice, and ask yourself, am I awake? Am I awake? Or am I on autopilot about some of these ideas? Because you and I, we're light bringers. We're light bringers. And the light that we bring makes a difference. So it is.